He pressed the coat into her hands before she could refuse. Rough hands, those knuckles split from the cold, a wedding band, worn thin, the grease of 100 repairs, ground into the skin. Owen Bennett kept the tower running floor by floor on a wage that never quite reached the end of the month. That morning he'd counted his last bills at the kitchen table, 2 small pairs of shoes lined up by the door. Then he'd spent every one of them not on his children, but on a coat for a stranger. She stood shivering at the loading dock, dark hair silvered with frost shoes worn to nothing, chin lifted against the cold. He never asked her name. He could never have guessed that the quiet woman in the second-hand coat owned the tower above him, the company inside it, every name on the payroll, his included. She took the coat, and that was all a small, careful nod, the kind a person offers when a kindness lands somewhere it was never meant to reach. Owen Bennett didn't wait to watch her put it on. Charity was always easier to accept when no one stood there measuring it, so he pushed back through the service door and let the wind seal the moment shut behind him. The tower swallowed him the way it always did. 42 floors of glass and brushed steel, and somewhere in the guts of it, a valve was weeping. A ballast was humming. A door was dragging on a bad hinge, and all of it sooner or later came down to him. Owen knew the building the way a surgeon knows a body. He knew which stairwells ran cold and which freight car groaned before it moved, which offices went dark at 6, and which kept their lamps burning long after the cleaning carts had rolled home. A maintenance man goes everywhere. He carries a ring of keys that opens doors most people never think about, and he learns to move through a room without leaving a mark on anyone's memory, present in every corner of a place and remembered in none of them. It suited him being unseen. It left him room to think about the only 2 things that had mattered to him in a long while, and both of them were waiting in a walk-up on the west side, with the thermostat nudged down to save the bill. Lily was 8 now, old enough to pack her brother's lunch and lie clean about whether she'd eaten her own. Max was 5, and still asked some nights when his mother was coming home, as though death were a long trip and patience could undo it. She'd been gone 14 months. The word the doctors had settled on was aggressive, and it had earned the word. What it left behind was a drift of envelopes on the kitchen counter, each stamped in red, each a number Owen could neither pay nor outrun. He took the overnight shift whenever they offered it. He bled radiators for neighbors on the weekend for cash folded into his shirt pocket. And still the stack grew patient as frost on a window pane. So when he'd spent nearly the last of what he had on a coat for a shivering stranger that morning, it had not been because the money sat easy in his pocket. It was because he knew better than most men alive exactly what it felt like to be cold and have no one in the world take notice. The stranger's name on the plastic badge clipped to her thin sweater read Ella Dawson. It was not her name. Her name was Claire Whitmore, and it stood bolted in steel letters across the face of the building she had just stepped back into, though not one of the 600 souls inside could have picked her face out of a crowd. She had spent nearly all her life somewhere else. Schools in Switzerland, a university in England, a still apartment in a city 3,000 miles from Chicago, where her father's name meant nothing, and she was free to be no one at all. He had wanted it exactly so. Whitmore men did not raise their children in front of cameras, and so while the company swelled into a thing of 42 floors and a stock ticker and a boardroom thick with appetite, his only daughter grew up a stranger. To every part of it, a name on a letterhead, a photograph the press had never once managed to take. Then her father died, and the shelter of that anonymity turned overnight into a trap. It had begun a few weeks earlier in an office that smelled of old paper and older money across a desk from the single living person who knew exactly who Claire Whitmore was. Margaret Cole had kept the family's secrets for the better part of 30 years, and she delivered the worst of them, the way she delivered everything else plainly without a cushion, as though bad news went stale if you held it in your mouth too long. She'd laid a slim folder on the desk between them and rested her hand flat on it a moment before she slid it across. "Your father left instructions," Margaret said. "You are not going to like them." Claire had opened the folder and read it once, then again, because the first time her eyes refused to make sense of it. 60 days. That was the shape of the thing. For 60 days, she was to take a position at the very bottom of Whitmore Industries, an ordinary job, an ordinary desk, under a name that was not her own. No title, no car idling at the curb, no assistant to file down the rough edges of the hours. Her accounts, every last one, would freeze the moment she signed. She would live on precisely what the job paid, and not a dollar past it. No one was to know her. Not the staff, not the board that would go on steering the company in her absence, watching from a distance to see whether the Whitmore girl was built of anything worth the name. Only Margaret would know, and if Claire broke it, if she spoke her own name aloud before the 60th day was spent, the inheritance was forfeit. The whole of it. The tower, the company, the fortune her father had bled his life into, all of it, would pass to the board, and she would walk away, holding nothing but a surname. He can't have been serious," Claire had said. "He was dying," Margaret answered. "People are never more serious than that." Claire had looked at her then, searching the older woman's face for some crack of sympathy to pry open. Why would he do this to me?" "Because he wanted to be sure," Margaret said. And something in how she stopped there made it plain she was giving only the top layer of a deeper answer. Sure, the company would land in hands that understood what it cost to hold it. That was as much as he'd tell me. The rest he took with him. Everything in Claire, the part of her raised to expect the world to arrange itself around a Whitmore, had wanted to shove the folder back across the desk and let the board choke on the company if that was what her father's ghost demanded of her. What stopped her was a small thing. It nearly always is. She'd carried her mother's hairpin with her that day, the way she carried it most days, a slender piece of silver and pearl that had passed down through the Whitmore women for close to a century, the last surviving trace of a woman who had died when Claire was still young enough that the memory of her had worn soft at the corners. Her mother had never cared much for the fortune either. What she had cared about was whether a person stayed kind when there was nothing to be gained by it. She used to say you could take the measure of anyone in a single winter just by watching whether they noticed the people the cold reached first. Claire had turned the pin over in her fingers there in that quiet office and thought of her mother and understood slowly that perhaps 60 days at the bottom of the world was not a punishment at all. Perhaps it was the only inheritance that had ever been worth having. She had signed her false name on the line, and it was done. What none of them understood, not Claire in her borrowed coat, not Owen with his heavy ring of keys, was that those same 60 days had swung a door wide open for someone else entirely. With the old man in the ground and the heir vanished into an errand no one could account for, Whitmore Industries had a throne, and no one seated on it. The board convened and adjourned and convened again, and in the soft gaps between all that caution, Gerald Hastings went quietly to work. He had been executive vice president for 6 years, long enough to learn where every dollar in the company slept and how to walk it out the side door without waking anyone. He had the easy smile of a man who remembered the names of your children, and beneath it, the still patience of one who had already, in some private ledger of his own, counted your chair among his belongings. While the board wrung its hands over succession, Gerald moved figures between accounts that no living Whitmore was watching, courted the timid members over long dinners, and let it be understood gently that a company could not run forever on the memory of a dead man. Someone steady would have to take the wheel. He was only ever standing where the light happened to fall. He did not know the heir was 3 floors below him some mornings pushing a mail cart in worn-down shoes. If he had, he would have moved faster. By the end of that first week, Claire had learned the taste of a life she had only ever read about from a comfortable distance. She learned that a temp is spoken to, not with. That a smart remark from a woman 3 years her junior could land and stick for a whole afternoon. That a body could be tired in a way sleep didn't touch the particular ache of being small in a place that had no reason to see you. She had learned to count coins at a lunch counter and put half of what she wanted back, and she had learned walking the long, cold stretch of the loading dock each morning because the main doors funneled her past people she'd rather not face. Exactly how quickly Chicago in winter could find the gaps in a thin sweater, which was where a maintenance man she had never met had found her, and without a word about who she was or wasn't, without wanting a single thing in return, had put a warm coat into her hands and walked away before she could refuse it. She sat at her borrowed desk at the end of that day, with the gray wool still draped over her shoulders, and turned her mother's hairpin slowly between 2 fingers, and felt something she had not felt since the funeral, since long before it, if she was honest, the plain, startling warmth of having been noticed. Not the air, not the name on the building, just a cold woman in a hard week, seen by a stranger who had less than she did and gave anyway. She did not yet know his name. She did not know that far above her head, floor by floor, a quieter and colder kind of ambition had already begun to turn, and that the first thing standing in its way, though no one had marked it yet, was going to be the man who'd given her his coat. His name, she learned 2 days later, was Owen. She got it the way she got most things now. Sideways and secondhand, a supervisor barking it down a corridor, Bennett the ice machine on 11's leaking again. And she turned the word over that evening, the way she turned the hairpin, as though holding it to the light, might tell her something about the man. It told her nothing, and that was its own kind of answer. In the world she'd been raised in, a name arrived freighted with a family, a fortune, a place at a table. Here it was just a sound people used when something had broken and they needed it fixed. The coat, meanwhile, had become the one warm fact of her days. She wore it every morning down the long throat of the loading dock, and every morning it did the small, stubborn work of reminding her that one person in the building had looked at her and seen a person back. She needed the reminder. The temp desk they'd handed her sat at the intersection of every errand no one else wanted, and the woman who ran the floor, a brisk, glossy thing named Paige, who couldn't have been more than 25, had decided in the first hour that Ella Dawson was slow and had never once revisited the verdict. There were the small cruelties that cost nothing. The lunch orders Claire was sent to fetch and never thanked for. The way conversation sealed itself shut when she came near, like water closing over a dropped stone. She had signed contracts worth more than this entire floor's salaries combined, and now she counted quarters at a lunch counter and put the sandwich back for the cup of soup, and no one who passed her would ever have guessed the distance between those two facts. Owen was the exception, and he was the exception, without seeming to try. He'd come to fix the radiator that ran cold behind her desk, and while he worked, he'd talk to her the way he'd talk to anyone. No pity in it. No angle. Just a man filling a companionable quiet while his hands did something useful. He asked whether the new coat was holding up against the cold. He warned her which vending machine $8 and gave nothing back. When Paige sent her off on some pointless errand with that particular curl of contempt, Owen caught Claire's eye afterward and said, "Lo, she was you 3 winters ago. First job. Somebody made her feel small, so now she's got to hand it down. Doesn't make it right, just makes it ordinary." It was the most anyone had said to her, rather than at her in weeks, and Claire found herself thinking about it long after the radiator had ticked back to warmth. She began, without quite deciding to look for him. The turn came on a gray Thursday in the last hour of the day. She was carrying a stack of files down to the 4th floor when she heard it. a child's voice unmistakable echoing thin and lost through a stairwell that was never meant to hold one. She followed it and found a boy of 5 sitting on the bottom step, with his backpack still buckled on, swinging his feet and trying very hard to look as though he did this every day. Owen came around the corner a half-second behind her, and the look on his face was the specific terror of a man who has run out of every option but the one he swore he'd never use. The sitter had fallen through. There was no one. School let out at 3, and his shift ran to 6, and on the worst days the two facts met in the middle with nothing to bridge them but a boy on a stairwell and a father's frayed nerve. "I can watch him," Claire heard herself say. Owen looked at her like she'd offered to carry water in her hands. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't." She crouched down to the boy's level. "I'm Ella. Your dad fixes things. What do you fix?" Max considered this with great seriousness. "Nothing. But I know all the trucks." "Then you're going to have to teach me," she said, "because I know none of them." And something in the boy's face eased, and something in Owen's did too. She spent the last hour of that day sitting on a stairwell with a 5-year-old learning the difference between a front loader and a backhoe with a gravity she hadn't brought to a board presentation in years. And when 6 o'clock came and Owen appeared coat on exhaustion, worn into him like the grease in his knuckles, he stood a moment in the doorway watching the two of them, and then he said awkwardly, because he was a man who had clearly forgotten how to offer anyone anything, "You should come up. It's not much, but it's warmer than the train." And Lily made too much of whatever it is she made. The walk up on the west side was exactly what he'd warned her. It was small and worn and scrubbed within an inch of its life by someone determined that poor and dirty would never be allowed to mean the same thing under his roof. There were 2 pairs of small shoes lined up by the door, with a care that undid her a little. There was a girl of 8 standing guard over a pot of pasta with the fierce competence of a child who had been handed too much too early and had decided to be equal to it. And there was on the wall above the couch a photograph of a woman laughing, turned slightly away from the camera that no one in the room looked at directly, and no one could stop being aware of. Claire had grown up in rooms built to impress her. She had never once in any of them felt what she felt in that cramped apartment, watching a father cut a girl's overlarge portion in half and slide it onto his own plate so she wouldn't notice there hadn't been quite enough, the plain, unglamorous fact of being welcome. Not the air, not the name. Just a cold woman someone had decided to feed. It was later after Max had been folded, protesting into bed, and Lily had retreated to homework, that Owen said the thing that stayed with her. 14 months, he said when her eyes went against her will to the photograph. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and didn't look at it either. "People keep waiting for me to be past it. Like grief's a flu you get over. But you don't get over it. You just get more used to carrying it. Some mornings, I still make coffee for 2. He glanced at her, then half embarrassed. "Sorry. You didn't come here for this." "I don't mind," Claire said, and found that she meant it in a way that startled her. "It's honest. I don't get much of that." He studied her for a second longer than was comfortable, and she had the sudden vertiginous sense that this man who fixed broken things had noticed something in her that didn't fit some seam where Ella Dawson stopped and someone else began. But he only nodded and let it go, and refilled her cup without asking, and the moment passed. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that Claire Whitmore had wanted to tell someone the truth. It frightened her more than the cold ever had. She did not tell him. She couldn't. But she walked to the train that night with the warmth of that small kitchen still on her, and understood that somewhere in the last few weeks, the 60 days had stopped being a sentence she was serving and become a life she was impossibly beginning to live. High above all of it on the 38th floor, a different kind of arithmetic was running late into the night. Owen had drawn the overnight rotation that week, and overnight in a half-empty tower is a country of its own, the hum of systems idling the tick of the building, cooling in its bones, long, dim corridors, where a man with a cart and a ring of keys is the only thing moving. He didn't mind it. The work was simple, and the quiet was honest, and it paid the small premium that meant Lily could finally have winter boots that fit the old pair 2 sizes too small. He was replacing a ballast in the ceiling outside the executive records room a little after 1 in the morning when he saw the light burning under the door. He knew that room was supposed to be dark. He knew, too, that it wasn't his business a maintenance man learns fast which doors to walk past, but the shredder was running a long, continuous feed that no one runs at 1 in the morning for anything routine, and through the narrow glass panel he saw Gerald Hastings feeding documents into it by the fistful, while a second man Owen half recognized from the upper floors loaded a box of files onto a hand truck. There was a laptop open on the table, its screen awash of numbers Owen would not have understood if he'd stared at them all night. He understood none of it. He understood only that the executive vice president of the company was destroying records in the dead of night with a man he clearly didn't want seen, and that whatever it wasn't for Owen to know. He didn't stop. He didn't stare. He gathered his cart with the quiet efficiency of a man who has learned to be forgettable, and he moved on down the corridor, and by the time he'd reached the elevator, he had very nearly convinced himself he'd seen nothing at all. But Gerald had seen him, not clearly a shape past the glass, a cart the maintenance uniform. It was enough. Gerald Hastings had not gotten as far as he had by trusting to the odds that a witness would stay conveniently blind. He was at his desk before dawn, and the first thing he did was pull the building's access logs, and there it was, plain as a signature, a maintenance keycard 3rd floor issue present on the executive level at 1:07 in the morning, a name attached, Bennett O. He sat with that for a long moment, and then he pulled the man's file, and what he found in it pleased him the way a clean solution pleases a certain kind of mind. A widower, 2 children, a stack of medical debt that a single missed paycheck would turn into a catastrophe. No union standing, no leverage, no voice that anyone in the building was obligated to hear. The most disposable species of man there was a person whose word set against Gerald's would weigh exactly nothing. And there was the other thing. Gerald had noticed it in passing and filed it away the way he filed everything the maintenance man and the new temp heads together over a radiator, the woman laughing at something the man had said. He didn't know who Ella Dawson was. He didn't need to. He only registered that Owen Bennett had a person he cared about inside these walls, and Gerald Hastings had spent a career learning that a man with something to lose is a man you can steer. He would not merely be rid of the witness. He would make certain that when the man fell, no one in the building would spare him a second glance. The company gathered that Friday in the great glass atrium at the base of the tower, all of it from the boardroom down to the temps, summoned to mark 2 months since the founder's passing. It was the kind of event Claire had spent her whole life being kept away from, and now she stood in the middle of it. In her borrowed coat, one anonymous face in 600 watching men who had dined at her father's table murmur his praises into microphones. It should have felt like a triumph, that invisibility. Instead, it felt like standing at her own graveside. She had worn the hairpin. She always wore the hairpin. It was the one piece of her real self she had refused to surrender to the disguise tucked into her dark hair, where nobody ever looked twice. Somebody looked twice. He was an old man, one of the founder's original board, Walter Prentice, silver-haired, and stooped, the kind of man who had known the family back when it was still just a family. He drifted through the crowd the way the very old do, half in the room, and half somewhere 30 years gone, and his gaze snagged on Claire's hair, and stopped, and something moved behind his rheumy eyes that made her blood go cold. "That pin," he said, coming closer, peering at it with an intensity that scattered every thought in her head. "Where did you come by that pin, young lady? I've seen it before. I'd swear on my life I've seen it before." His voice dropped, wondering, almost frightened. "Eleanor Whitmore wore that pin. Every Christmas I can remember. I'd know it anywhere. It can't be the same." For one endless second, the whole disguise hung by a thread in the hands of a confused old man, and Claire felt the 60 days, the company her father's last impossible test, all of it balanced on what came out of her mouth next. "You have a wonderful eye," she said, and she smiled, and the smile was the hardest thing she had ever done. "It's a reproduction. There's a shop on the north side that copies estate pieces I saved for months. I never dreamed it was based on anything real. You must have known the family." She let a little awe into her voice, offered it to him like a gift. What were they like? And Walter Prentice, who wanted more than anything to have been right, allowed himself instead to be flattered, and the terrible light in his eyes guttered out into the vague pleasure of an old man asked to reminisce. He patted her hand. He wandered off into a story about Christmases long past, and Claire stood very still in the middle of the atrium, with her heart slamming against her ribs, and understood fully for the first time exactly how thin the ice beneath her had always been. She did not see Gerald across the room, watching the whole exchange with mild, filing interest, noting only that the temp seemed to know old Prentice and tucking it away with everything else. The trap closed the following Monday. It came as these things do, with the appearance of procedure, an email to Owen's supervisor, a report filed with Human Resources, a matter that regrettably had to be looked into. A company laptop was missing from the executive floor. Not just any laptop, one logged the record showed to the exact hour and level that a maintenance keycard had been present. Diane Kessler, from Human Resources, a tired woman who had learned long ago not to ask which of her superiors' fingerprints were on the paperwork she was handed, pulled the access logs and found precisely what she had been meant to find. Bennett O. 1:07 a.m. Owen was summoned to a windowless room on the second floor, and he went into it, still not understanding, and he came out of it. 40 minutes later, a man with the floor gone from under his feet. They had it all arranged. The logs put him on the floor. The laptop was gone. And when he said with the desperate reasonableness of an honest man who has never needed to prove his honesty before, that there were cameras that the cameras would show, he'd never gone into that room, never touched anything, only changed a ballast in the corridor, and left Diane Kessler slid a printout across the table without meeting his eyes. The footage from that corridor that night was gone. A system error, the report called it. A gap in the record. 6 hours of that particular camera on that particular level simply missing, as though the tower itself had blinked at exactly the wrong moment. He had no proof. That was the whole architecture of it. A man with no standing, no witness, and no footage against a paper trail built by someone who understood precisely how little his word was worth. They let him clear out his locker in front of the afternoon shift. That was the part that broke something in him. Not the accusation, but the walk, the long crossing of a floor he'd kept running for 3 years, while men and women he'd fixed 100 small problems for found somewhere else to look. Paige watched from her desk with her lips pressed thin. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice muttered something about, "You never can tell," and the words followed him out the way cold follows you through a thin coat. Claire heard it third hand. Within the hour, the temp desk was a clearinghouse for exactly this kind of news, and the version that reached her had already hardened into fact. The maintenance man. Stealing. Caught on the logs. Kids at home and everything, can you imagine? She stood at her borrowed desk with the files forgotten in her hands and felt the whole thing arrange itself in her mind with a terrible clarity. Because she knew this company. She knew it in her blood. And she knew that laptops did not vanish from the executive floor by accident, and camera footage did not erase itself 6 hours at a stretch on the one night it mattered. Someone had done this to him. Someone with the access to reach into the building's records and rewrite the truth. And the only thing Owen Bennett had done wrong, as far as she could tell, was be poor enough to make a convenient answer to a question no one else was asking. She found him after dark. She didn't fully decide to go looking. Her feet decided for her. She knew the small park across from the train. He took a scrap of frozen grass and bare trees, caught between the tower and the tracks. And something told her he wouldn't have gone home yet, that a man doesn't walk into a warm kitchen and tell an 8-year-old the floor is gone, until he's found some way to arrange his face. And there he was, on a bench beneath a dead street lamp, still in the gray of the coming night, his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, and the coat he wore was thinner than the one he'd given her. He didn't hear her at first. And so for a moment, Claire stood at the edge of the little park and simply watched him, this man who had spent his last dollars on a stranger's warmth, who cut his daughter's dinner onto his own plate, who still made coffee for 2 some mornings, sitting alone in the cold with everything taken from him for the crime of having seen something in the dark and been too poor to be believed. She thought of her mother. You can take the measure of anyone in a single winter just by watching whether they notice the people the cold reaches first. She thought of the folder on Margaret's desk. 60 days. Speak your name before the last of them and lose it all, the tower, the company, everything her father had bled his life into. And she understood, standing there in the dark, with the train sighing past behind her, that she had come to the edge of a choice her father's will had never accounted for, and that whatever she decided in the next few days was going to cost her something she could not get back. Owen lifted his head then and saw her, and the effort it took him to summon something like composure for her sake, even now, even gutted, still reaching to reassure someone else, was the thing that settled it. "Ella," he said, his voice roughened to almost nothing. "You shouldn't have come out here. It's freezing." Claire crossed the frozen grass toward him, and she did not yet know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew now that she was going to do it. She sat down beside him on the cold bench, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his, and for a while she said nothing at all. The trains went by behind them, throwing long bars of light across the frozen grass and taking them away again. Owen stared at his own split knuckles, as though the answer to something might be written there. "They think I stole from them," he said. Finally, his voice flat with disbelief. 3 years I kept that place running, and they walked me out like a criminal in front of everybody. I've got 2 kids, Ella. I've got a stack of bills already. I can't. His jaw worked. I don't even know how to tell Lily. She'll know something's wrong the second I open the door. She always knows. You didn't take anything. It wasn't a question. He looked at her, and something in her certainty seemed to reach him. No. I changed a ballast in a hallway, and I went home. That's the whole of it. I saw he stopped, and she watched him decide even now that whatever he'd seen was not a thing worth dragging her into. It doesn't matter what I saw. There's no proof of any of it. The cameras are gone. It's my word, and my word's worth nothing to those people. It's worth something to me, Claire said. He almost smiled at that, the sad, grateful smile of a man being handed a kindness he assumes can't change anything. You're a good person, but you're a temp 3 weeks in the door. What are you going to do? She did not answer him, because the honest answer would have broken the last rule she had left to break, and she was not going to break it here on a bench before she understood exactly what it would cost. So she only reached over, and for the first time laid her hand over his ruined one where it rested on his knee. "Go home to your children," she told him. "Tell Lily the truth, that you did nothing wrong, and that someone made a mistake, and that mistakes get fixed. Because this one is going to be fixed. I need you to believe that." He didn't believe it. She could see that he didn't. But he let her walk him to his train, and he went, and she stood on the cold platform, watching the lights of it shrink down the tracks. And then Claire Whitmore took out her phone and called the one person in the world who knew her name. Margaret Cole answered on the second ring the way she always did, as though she slept with the thing in her hand. "There are 11 days left," Margaret said before Claire had gotten out more than a sentence. She had listened to the whole of it without interruption. The man, the coat, the frame, the vanished footage. And when she spoke, there was no warmth in it, and no judgment, either only the flat clarity of a woman laying out a ledger. 11 days, and the company is yours. Everything your father built. If you walk into that building and say your name before, then you understand what happens. The board takes all of it. You will have thrown away an empire to save a maintenance man you have known for 3 weeks. "I know exactly what it is," Claire said. "Then wait." For the first time in 30 years, something that was almost pleading came into Margaret Cole's voice. 11 days. Once it's yours, you can reinstate him. You can bury Hastings. You can do anything you please with unlimited power, and nothing to lose. 11 days of patience. Claire and you save him and the company both. Why in God's name would you throw it away now? It was a good question. It was in cold arithmetic, the only sensible question. And Claire stood on the empty platform and thought about a man who had 11 days of debt collectors and a frightened 8-year-old, and a walk to make each morning past people who now believed the worst of him. 11 days of a 5-year-old asking why his father was home when he should be at work. And she understood that 11 days was an eternity to a family with nothing, and no time at all to a woman with everything. Because he didn't wait, she said. He saw someone cold, and he didn't run the numbers first. He just gave me the coat. She drew a breath of the freezing air. My mother used to say you could take the measure of anyone in a single winter just by watching whether they noticed the people the cold reached first. I've been so busy trying to prove I deserve this company that I never once asked whether the company deserved me. I'm done waiting, Margaret. Tell me what I need, and help me do it right. The line went still for a long moment. And then Margaret Cole, who had loved the girl's father and buried him and kept his last hard secret for 2 months, let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "All right," she said. "Then we do it right. If you're going to burn 11 days and an inheritance, we are not going to do it on a grand gesture. We are going to do it on evidence. What Owen Bennett had believed was gone forever turned out to be merely hidden, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a poor man and a woman who owned the servers. Deleted was not the same as destroyed. Claire knew it, and Margaret knew it, and the forensic specialists Margaret had on a retainer older than Claire knew it best of all. The corridor footage that Human Resources had written off as a system error had been flagged for deletion by a hand inside the building, but the tower's security system, like every serious system, kept its own redundant archive in cold storage 3 floors underground, and a deletion order given at the console does not reach down into the vault and scrub what's already sleeping there. It took the specialists a day and a half. What they pulled back was 6 hours of a dim executive corridor at 1 o'clock in the morning, and on it, plain as daylight, was Owen Bennett changing a ballast outside a door and walking away without ever laying a hand on it, and 40 minutes before that, through the narrow glass of the records room, was Gerald Hastings feeding documents into a shredder, while a second man loaded a hand truck. That was the first thread. The second was Owen's own account of what he had seen, which the frame had been built precisely to make worthless, and which the footage now made unshakable. And the third was the one Gerald had never imagined anyone would think to pull, because it required both the authority to demand it and the will to look. Owen's keycard had only ever touched the corridor. To put him inside that locked room, someone had reached into the system and manufactured a door entry that never happened, and every action taken against that system left a fingerprint, a record of which credential had reached in and when. The forged door log, the deletion order that wiped the corridor camera, the filing of the missing laptop report itself. Trace them back through the machine one by one, and every thread ran to the same two credentials, Gerald Hastings and an accomplice from the upper floors whose nerve, it would turn out, did not survive his first hour alone in a room with a forensic accountant. And once the accountant had a reason to open the accounts, Gerald had spent 6 patient years quietly moving figures between the theft of a single laptop became the least of what the man had done. Claire assembled all of it, the footage, the testimony, the trail, and then she called the board of Whitmore Industries into session. Margaret made the demand in her own name as the executor of the founder's estate. No temp's keycard could have pried open a single server, but the woman who had spoken for the dead man's affairs for a month could open all of them. Gerald Hastings walked into that boardroom the following Tuesday, certain that he was walking toward a coronation. The founder, 2 months in the ground, the heir vanished into whatever errand had swallowed her, the timid members courted, and the numbers arranged. He had spent the morning rehearsing the modest, reluctant way a man accepts a burden he has in fact been engineering for years. He took his seat near the head of the long glass table. He straightened his cuffs, and he was still wearing the small, confident smile when the door opened, and a woman in a plain sweater and worn-down shoes walked in and stood at the head of the table, where no temp had any business standing. For a moment the board simply stared, and Gerald's smile curdled into something between confusion and outrage, because he knew that face, the new girl, the one who'd been thick with the maintenance man, the one who'd known old Prentice. "Most of you have never met me," the woman said, and her voice had changed. It was not Ella Dawson's careful, invisible murmur, but something level and certain that filled the room to its glass corners. "My father asked that it stay that way for a while. My name is Claire Whitmore. I own this company." The sound that went around the table was not quite a gasp, and not quite silence. At the far end, old Walter Prentice half rose from his chair, his mouth working, and Claire met his eyes, and reached up and drew the silver and pearl pin from her dark hair and set it on the glass in front of them all, and the old man sank back down with his hand pressed to his mouth, because he had been right. After all 30 years of Christmases had not lied to him. It was Eleanor Whitmore's pin, and this was Eleanor Whitmore's daughter. Gerald found his voice. "This is some kind of stunt. There's no possible way to verify." "There is," Margaret Cole said from the doorway, folder in hand, "and it's already done. But I'd sit down, Gerald, if I were you, because Miss Whitmore didn't call this meeting to introduce herself." What followed took less than 20 minutes and ended a man's life as he had built it. Claire laid it out without heat and without mercy. The footage from the vault the deletion had never reached, projected up onto the wall, so the whole board could watch Owen Bennett walk away from a door he'd never opened, and Gerald Hastings destroy the records behind it. The trail of credentials that ran the forged logs and the vanished laptop straight back to the man himself. And then the accounts, 6 years of them, the patient quiet theft laid open by people who did this for a living. Gerald came out of his chair somewhere in the middle of it protesting, and the protests thinned into nothing as the evidence stacked up in front of the only audience whose opinion had ever mattered to him, and by the end, he was simply standing there gray-faced, while the security men Margaret had waiting stepped in from the corridor. He was walked out of the tower in front of the executive floor, the way he had arranged for another man to be walked out a week before, except that the men waiting for Gerald Hastings at the bottom were not from human resources. They were from the police. Owen was not in the boardroom for any of it. He had been asked to come to the building that afternoon, told only that there was news regarding his case, and coming despite himself, because a man with 2 children cannot afford to ignore even the thinnest thread of hope. He was sitting in a quiet office on the executive floor, still braced for one more humiliation, when the door opened, and Ella Dawson walked in, wearing a suit that had plainly cost more than he made in a year. and the whole world tilted under him. "Sit down, Owen," she said gently. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." He listened to the whole of it standing up because he could not make himself sit. That the woman he'd bought a coat for could not have needed it less. That she owned the name on the building, the floor beneath his feet, the paycheck they'd taken from him. That she had spent 11 days of an inheritance worth more than he could conceive to prove that he had done nothing wrong. And when she had finished, the thing that moved across his face was not gratitude. It was something closer to hurt. So all of it was, he stopped. "You knew who I was the whole time. You saw the apartment. You saw the shoes by the door. You watched me cut Lily's dinner in half, and the whole time you were—" His voice caught on the size of it. "I gave you a coat, Ella. I felt sorry for you." "I know," Claire said. "And in 3 years no one in that building looked at me and saw a person who was cold. You did, when I was nothing to you, when you thought I was less than nothing." She took a step toward him. "I didn't lie about who I was because it was a game. I lied because it was the only way anyone was ever going to show me the truth. And the truest thing anyone has shown me in years was a man with 2 kids and a stack of bills giving away his last $40 to a stranger who couldn't do a single thing for him in return. Don't you dare be ashamed of that. It's the best thing I've ever seen." Whatever he'd been holding on to went out of him then, and he sat down after all and put his face in his ruined hands, and Claire crossed the room and sat beside him the way she had on the frozen bench. And this time it was her hand that stayed, and his that turned to hold it. It was Margaret later who explained the rest why the board had not risen up to strip Claire of everything the moment she spoke her name 11 days early. There had been a second letter, she said, sealed to be opened only if Claire chose to break the disguise before her time was up. Her father had written it, knowing his daughter, knowing the pride he'd raised in her, and the kindness her mother had left in her, and unsure to the last which of the two would win. If she has broken this open, the letter read it is because she found something worth more to her than the company. And that is the only proof I ever truly wanted. The 60 days were never the test. What she was willing to lose was the test. Give her everything. She has earned it by being ready to walk away. They were married in the spring, in a small hall, with folding chairs and Lily scattering petals with the fierce seriousness of a girl entrusted with something important, and Max in a bow tie he tugged at all afternoon. Owen had gone back to Whitmore Industries, but not to the basement, and not he'd insisted to any post handed down out of affection. He ran the building's operations now, all of it. 42 floors of systems he understood better than any man alive, and he'd taken it only once. Claire swore to him it was the work he'd earned, and not the husband she'd bought. He kept his self-respect the way he kept everything plainly and without fuss, and it turned out to matter more to their happiness than either of them could have said. The night before the wedding, Claire had knelt down in front of an 8-year-old girl and taken the silver and pearl pin from her own hair and fixed it carefully into Lily's, and told her it had belonged to her grandmother and her great-grandmother before that, and that it went to the women of the family who understood what it was really worth, which was nothing at all, and everything depending entirely on who was wearing it and why. And on a small table near the door, where every guest passed it coming in, there hung a gray wool coat second-hand and worn soft at the cuffs that a man had once bought with the last of his money for a freezing stranger he owed nothing, never knowing that the smallest warmth he had to give would be the thing that changed both their lives.